America's founding fathers used their advanced learning to build a new nation, but they were the elites, and despite the Puritan belief that literacy was a direct line to God, the reality of colonial schooling may surprise you. Schools in the newly founded American colonies were a hodgepodge. Some students did their learning at home, and it more or less stopped there. Others made it to a schoolhouse, where instructors of varying quality taught them reading, math, and more. In addition to the basics, schoolmasters were charged with shaping their students into upstanding citizens, sometimes with the application of a switch.
Thank you, sir.
In addition, school attendance in colonial America was far from consistent. Many students had to take time off to help their families, especially during busy agricultural seasons. Others, like girls and black students, faced seemingly insurmountable barriers to the pursuit of education. Like anything else in those early days of a new country, it wasn't easy. For the Puritans, literacy was an obligation to God. To them, a priest reading out of a Latin Bible or sermonizing to an illiterate congregation was an affront to the Almighty. You had to read the Bible for yourself, taking your faith into your own hands. This is why in the early Puritan-controlled colonies, school buildings popped up faster than nearly any other structure. The 1642 Massachusetts compulsory attendance law required that all children receive a basic education. And in addition, families and apprentice masters were also required to teach their young ones a useful trade. But the new law didn't necessarily require students to attend a school, as long as someone in their household taught them to read the Bible and understand the law. Then there was the fact that enforcement of the 1642 law was spotty, which led to the 1647 Massachusetts General School Law, more colorfully known as the Old Deluder Satan Law. This new legislation required towns of more than 50 households to establish a school and pay a dedicated school teacher. Settlements with more than 100 homes were required to establish a more advanced grammar school meant to send its students off to college. Educating the children of the colonies wasn't just about making sure they knew their letters and numbers. It was about indoctrinating them into a way of life. The Old Deluder Satan Law of 1647 explicitly refers to Satan as the enemy of the Bible and of the knowledge necessary to read it. To put it bluntly, educating children was fighting the devil. The youngest children learned their letters and numbers with a horn book, a board that simply held a single sheet of paper and a thin translucent cover made from animal horn. The basic texts, meant to be traced by beginning learners, typically included the Lord's Prayer. For more advanced learners, there was the New England Primer. First published in 1688, it combined morality with literacy skills, along with illustrations into the textbook. The Primer doesn't hold back. Lessons include rhyming couplets like, "In Adam's fall we sinned all, and the judgment made Felix afraid." The Puritans weren't the only intellectual forces at work in the American colonies. The secular ideas of the Enlightenment were popular in grammar schools and colleges attended by the colonial elites. There, rather than preaching at students, an Enlightenment-inspired curriculum included science education, reasoning, advanced mathematics, and even philosophy. This style of education clearly influenced key members of the coming American Revolution, including Benjamin Franklin, even though his formal schooling ended around the time he was 10.
Do you not believe in saying what you think?
No, I'm very much against it. Thinking aloud is a habit responsible for much of mankind's misery.
However, some citizens thought these high-flying intellectual institutions were all well and good for the upper crust, but practical schooling needed to include subjects that would help students survive, such as account keeping and business writing. Many colonial communities were required to have a schoolhouse, but that doesn't mean families could send their children there for free. In Northampton, Massachusetts, students were charged 4 pence to learn English, and another 6 pence for the school teacher to throw in a smattering of Latin and account keeping. Towns typically kicked in something to boost teacher pay, but in places like Northampton, it wasn't enough to support a schoolmaster, especially if he had a family. He may have relied to some extent on local citizens for survival. For instance, community members might bring in food, which could act in place of cash in rural areas where it was more useful for the teacher to have wheat and corn than currency. In the winter, students were often expected to bring in wood to keep the schoolhouse fire going and stave off a miserable freezing day at the books. The quality of schooling varied dramatically throughout the colonies. Northern cities and towns were able to support a 2-step system of basic home-based dame schools followed by more advanced instruction in a schoolhouse. But in the South, colonists were more likely to live in far-flung, heavily agricultural settlements that couldn't support more than a rudimentary school system. In some of the more rural places, families were expected to homeschool their children. Often, a child's first teacher was their mother. Even wealthy members of the society had difficulty finding a good education. In the rural South, rich families might send their kids overseas for a European education. That was the case for George Washington's 2 eldest elder half-brothers who were sent to England to study. However, the death of their father, Augustine Washington, when George was 11, meant the younger boy had to stay behind in Virginia to cobble together an education.
The education of George Washington was experience rather than schooling.
This was an embarrassment to him later in life, especially when he began working with the formerly educated likes of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams.
John Adams went to Harvard. Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary. George Washington went to war.
Teacher training didn't exist in America until the 19th century. Before that, a school teacher could be just about anyone with a basic education who was willing to take on the job. Any man, that is. Women didn't come to dominate the field for several generations.
I think if you fell off the hay cart and hit your head a few too many times, you might have turned out to be the person who was teaching older kids in the village school.
Colonial teachers often relied on rote memorization and copy work when it came to crafting their lessons. And while some teachers were up to the job, others have gone down in history as real duds, including George Washington's first teacher. Fortunately, Washington, who never attended a formal school beyond the elementary level, had access to tutors, educational texts, time, and the gumption needed to further his education at home. While many modern educators are reluctant and even outright forbidden to use corporal punishment, for colonial teachers, it was expected. The rules for a 1645 school in Dorchester, Massachusetts reminds readers that the rod of correction is a rule of God necessary sometimes to be used on children. The belief, at least among the Puritans, was that children were innately sinful. Left to their own devices, they would become slothful dullards with no self-discipline and no hope of contributing to the community. Any signs of these tendencies was to be literally beaten out of the students. With such moral and spiritual high stakes, it's perhaps less surprising to learn how often a colonial teacher broke out a switch. However, some teachers were rough even by the standards of the time, and some were a little more than prisoners. In the southern colonies in particular, teachers could be indentured slaves or minor criminals, nor were they all upstanding members of the community. Accounts of the time talk about teachers who were a bit too fond of drinking, gambling, and other seedy pastimes. Though women were largely shut out of the teaching profession until the 19th century, there was at least one place in the American colonies where a female teacher didn't raise eyebrows. Often called dame schools, these classrooms were typically inside a local woman's home. Dame schools combined childcare and early instruction in reading and practical household work. Dame schools filled in the gap in communities where people lived too far from a settlement to easily send their kids to school. A local woman could gather most of the young ones in her home and get them started with basics like the alphabet. And in more far-flung places, she might have taught more advanced subjects. When it came to dame schools, few municipalities tried to legislate attendance fees, so families might catch a financial break. Some towns even allowed outlying settlements to deduct the dame's pay from their contributions to a more dedicated schoolmaster's salary. If a colonial child made it through basic schoolroom instruction and their family had the means, they might move on to grammar school. These schools were typically only for the sons of well-off families. Admission was closed to girls. The first known grammar school in the colonies was the Boston Latin School, which opened in 1635. The Boston Latin School, and others to follow, was meant to prepare its students for college, which required a good understanding of Greek and Latin. As for other subjects, grammar schools might educate their students in the humanities, advanced mathematics, and of course, religion. This was still colonial New England, after all. As the 18th century approached, grammar schools began to feel pressure from competing academies, which had a more practical focus. With income from student tuition on the line, many grammar schools broadened their educational approach to include subjects like history and geography. Still, for practically the entire colonial period, grammar schools were seen as a pipeline to elite colleges. Despite the growing number of schools, the Puritan emphasis on education, and the flourishing of Enlightenment ideals, the reality was that these intellectual opportunities were reserved for boys. Girls learned to read and write, sure, and families with enough time and money might educate them further, but it was generally assumed that their future lay in being wives and mothers. They needed just enough education to run a household and raise children. Anything beyond that was an affectation.
You're to be educated as a gentlewoman.
I don't want to be a gentlewoman. I do.
Girls did attend woman-led dame schools and schoolhouses with boys, though, at least in some colonial settlements. They went to dame schools for a longer period of time instead of moving on to a formal schoolhouse. But as the colonies moved towards open rebellion against Great Britain, women took on increasingly active work outside of the home. This led to greater interest in female education, with notables like Abigail Adams calling out gender inequality in the schoolroom. Yet, even Abigail Adams wasn't about to argue that women should be admitted to the highest levels of learning in the colonies. While a few European women had earned college degrees by the 18th century, one of the first American women to do so was Catherine Brewer Benson, who was awarded a degree from Wesleyan College in 1840. For Native Americans who encountered European colonists, the new arrivals' attempts to establish schools were a part of a larger campaign to convert them from an indigenous way of life. Some colonists taught Native children individually, while others supported their entry into schools like Moore's Charity School, established in 1754. School founder Eleazar Wheelock believed that his school, which also accepted white students, would set up Native children for success in the colonies. As such, girls were instructed how to be a proper colonial housewife, while boys learned Latin and farmed. Wheelock, with the help of the children he taught, like Mohegan Reverend Sampson Occam, raised enough money to open a college for indigenous people. However, the institution, Dartmouth College, catered more to its white students and enrolled few Native ones. Other colonial colleges had at least a partial mission of educating Native people and converting them to Christianity. Harvard College wrote in its 1650 charter that it intended to educate the English and Indian youth of this country in knowledge and godliness. In its 1693 royal charter, William and Mary College claimed that, among other goals, it existed so that the Christian faith may be propagated among the Western Indians to the glory of Almighty God. However, as with Dartmouth, very few American Indians actually attended these colonial colleges, and it became clear that at least some institutions were using this missionary zeal merely to solicit donations.